This is easy tutorial of knitting a hat. All stitches and techniques are shown step by step in the video. This tutorial uses yarn in 2 colors, circular knitting needles, stitch markers, scissors, a darning needle, and another set of circular needles or one double-pointed needle, preferably same or smaller size than the main needles. Stitches and techniques used are provisional cast on, right stitch, knit through the back loop, knit 2 together, picking up stitches, magic loop, 3 needle join, jogless stripes, casting off, and weaving in the yarn ends. Use timestamps in the video to navigate. My yarn weight is fingering weight / superfine. There is 400 meters of yarn in 100-gram ball. This particular yarn has 16 wraps per inch. I'm using 3mm needles, and this combination gives me the gauge of 21 stitches per 10 centimeters. This is measured from the surface of a stockinette knitting that has been soaked and blocked. I have a gauge measure like this, but you can measure your gauge with any ruler or a tape measure just as well. This measure in the video is before soaking, and it gives 11 stitches per 5 centimeters, which is 22 stitches per 10 centimeters. If I'd used this to calculate my stitches, I'd got almost 2.5 centimeters too wide circumference for the hat, and that's a lot in a hat. Therefore, I encourage you to check your gauge carefully if you are uncertain of it. Knit a 15 centimeters times 15 centimeters swatch, soak it, let it dry, and then do the measuring. Then few words about the yarn weight and picking the right yarn. In my opinion, wraps per inch is the best way to check if the yarn weight of the chosen yarn is the same or close enough than needed. Even if meters per grams would be the same, there can still be a difference in thickness, which can show in your knitting. Wraps per inch quite literally means wraps of yarn per inch of a tulle. I have a tool like this, and the measuring is done by rubbing the yarn evenly to the measure and counting the wraps. I have 16 wraps per inch. This tool has also another way of measuring the yarn weight. You can check in which hole your yarn goes, and it will tell you the yarn weight and the approximate wraps per inch as well. But as you can see, even though I got 16 wraps per inch, the tool says the yarn is fingering weight and the measure should be 14 wraps per inch. This is why, for example, the name fingering weight does not tell everything, and there is a decent amount of variety of the yarn weights under every category. And that is why checking the wraps per inch gives you the best idea if 2 different yarns are similar in weight or not. Now, one more thing. Fancy tools are nice, but by no means mandatory. I'll show you the cheap and easy way to craft your own measure. You need a pencil, sticky tape, and some measuring equipment with inches. Cut 2 pieces of sticky tape. Attach the first one to the top of the pencil. Then measure carefully 1 inch and attach the other sticky tape there. And it's done! You crafters might have some prettier tapes and pencils to make it a bit fancier. I just took what I had laying around to give you the idea. Nevertheless, it works like a charm. Written pattern is available in Ravelry. Now let's begin. We'll use the needles and both yarns. Red one is going to be the main color. For the provisional cast on, we'll be needing about 60 centimeters of yarn in different color. Any leftover yarn will do fine. It makes things easier when the yarn is in different color than the main yarn and when it is same yarn weight or thicker. At first, make a slip knot to both yarn ends. Then place both slip knots to your right hand needle, the leftover yarn first. If needed, tighten them up a bit. Place the yarns as shown. Red yarn comes under the yellow yarn. Take the red yarn over the needle and around the yellow yarn. And repeat. Take the red yarn over the needle and then around the yellow yarn. And repeat. This is what we are to repeat. Try to keep the tension even. Not too loose, but not overly tight either. It helps if you press your right hand's index finger over the red yarn loop before rolling it under the yellow yarn. Now cast on in total 125 plus 1 stitches. The slip knot counts as 1 stitch as well. Now sometimes, and especially with somewhat toothy yarn, you might end up with a mess like this. I suggest to pull the yarn separate, like so, after every stitch to avoid tangles. This is how the cast on should look like. You can gently pull the stitches a bit away from each other, but it is not mandatory. Now it may seem this is never going to be a big enough hat, but have no fear. Our work is going to widen up after few rows. Take the red yarn on last time under the yellow yarn and then turn your work. The first row is knitted before joining in the round. Place the yarn and needles as shown. This row is knitted in right stitch but through the back loop. Take the right hand needle through the back loop of the first stitch. Take the needle under the working yarn and pull the yarn through the first stitch. Then release the original stitch from the left hand needle. Again, needle through the back loop, needle under the working yarn and through the stitch and release the original stitch. I'll sew it few more times. Continue like this until you've knitted all the stitches. At the end, just drop the yellow slipknot off the needle. You can open it if you want, for it is now done its duty. However, leave the yellow yarn in place, that one we need. The amount of yarn ends might seem a bit confusing. Here's what I like to do. Take the yarn end and make a small skein of it. Then tie it into a knot. Do the same with other yarn ends. Now, if you have a bit longer cable like me, we'll use the magic loop to fit the cable to our work. Magic loop is a fancy way of saying pull your cable out a little bit in between your stitches. Here's how it's done. Divide your stitches into two. You can count where the exact middle is or just approximate the place. My cable is so twisted I had to stick the needles into the yarn ball to actually get the thing done. Then take your needles and bring the stitches close to the needle tips. Make sure your knitting is not twisted, but that the cast-on edge of the knitting is pointing down. Now, you can do this with your fingers, but I like to use a needle. Take the first stitch from the further needle, which holds that end of the knitting where the working yarn is. Change its residence to another needle. Then take the stitch next to it and lift that one over the migrated one. Now we are having again the correct amount of stitches, which was 125. Now pull the further needle out and hold your yarn and needles as shown. The working yarn should come between the cable and the left-hand needle. Then take the right-hand needle into the first stitch, take the needle under the working yarn and pull the yarn through. Then release the original stitch from the left-hand needle. Again, right-hand needle into the stitch, needle under the working yarn, pull through and release the original stitch. By the way, this is how I hold my working yarn. There is no right or wrong here. Pick the style that works for you. Knit until you hit the place where the cable sticks out and I'll meet you there. So here's last few stitches. And after the last one, our left-hand needle is free. To continue, we will turn our work. Again, the yarn should come between the cable and the needle. Now push the cable and needle closer to you into your knitting and pull the further one out. Then just continue knitting right stitch. Keep going until you have 6 centimeters of knitting. So here's the knit so far. Take the yellow yarn, hold it like shown and start knitting right stitch. Don't worry if the first stitches are loose, we'll be fixing that later. Knit one round with yellow yarn. Here are last stitches. Now take the red yarn under the yellow yarn, so that the red yarn kind of takes hold of the yellow one. Start knitting with the red yarn again and knit couple of stitches. Now you can cut the yellow yarn. I like to wrap the yarn ends around each other once, but not more. I'll tighten them gently, but not too much. Later we will weave in the yarn ends. Knit until the folded knitting measures 8 centimeters. I changed my cable to a little shorter one, so I'll have only one loop sticking out. But yes, what if there is a knot in the yarn? It is not advisable to knit them straight in. Wool is almost a living thing, and because of that, knots tend to open over time. Also, when knitted straight in, they tend to leave a bump. What I'd suggest is to open the knot or just cut it out. Then leave an end long enough to weave in later. Then just continue with the yarn, leaving again long enough end. Now it usually shows where the yarn change is. This is why I like to wrap the yarn ends around each other, but not to make an actual knot. Just little something to close the gap. Weaving in the ends will finish the look and keep the gap closed. Now, here's the place where there was the knot. It is still a bit loose, but not to worry. We'll knit over it one more time and then weave in the ends. The gap still shows because knitting these close by rows will stretch the yarns out. But we can tighten the gap back by pulling the yarn ends. However, I'll use the yellow yarn ends as an example because it is easier to see. I use mostly two ways to weave in the ends. The first one is to mimic the loops of the knitting. This creates a bit thicker spot on the fabric, which might not be the best choice in the foot of the sock, for example, where you might feel it. Other manner is to weave in the yarn end under the burl pumps in every other row, like shown here. When the folded knitting measures 8 centimeters, it is time to pick up stitches from the cast-on edge. You can use another set of cable needles or one double-pointed needle. Make sure you are picking the stitches to the same direction where you would be knitting. Now we are to follow the yellow yarn. Now we are to follow the yellow yarn and one by one picking the loops of the red yarn to our needle. If you have a cable needle, you can go ahead and pick all the stitches right away. With the double-pointed needle, we are to pick about 20 to 30 stitches at a time. Then we start the 3-needle join and pick some more. Now turn your knitting so that the wrong sides are against each other. Place your left hand working needle and pickup needle side by side. Now we are going to knit right stitch, but do it from 2 different needles at the same time. Take your right hand needle through the first stitch of the first needle and then through the first stitch of the second needle. Bring the working yarn over your right hand needle and pull it through both of the original stitches. Then release both original stitches. I'll show it few more times. If you find it tricky to hold the needles side by side, you can use stitch marker to tie them together. Every now and again, pick up more stitches from the cast on edge and keep going until all the stitches are united. With this provisional cast on method, in the pick up edge there is one stitch less compared to the actual stitches. Since one was already decreased from the actual stitches when joining in the round, the amounts of stitches match. Now we can remove the yellow provisional cast on yarn. From here we are to knit 6 more centimeters. Now we are going to pick up stitches from our yellow stripe to do the 3 needle join one more time. Important thing here is that we are also going to change the direction we are knitting in. Normally we would continue to knit this way, but from here on we are going to knit the other direction. And the 3 needle join is the first row knitted to the other direction. So we are to start picking up stitches accordingly, kind of like going backwards. The starting place is easy to see because there is a little jog in the stripe. Our yellow stitches look like little letter V's. We are picking those legs of the V's that lean left. The only reason why we knitted this yellow stripe is to make this step easier. Believe it or not, it is extremely easy to get lost into similar colored rows and make uneven and wonky pick-up row. With cable needle, you can once again pick up the whole row at once. This next step is basically 3 needle join again, that we already know, only with a little bit more knitting in our hands. Join all the stitches together and I'll meet you at the end of the row. I'll knit the last few stitches with you. Somehow, at least to me, these last stitches and between steps phases are a bit scary if I do not actually see how they are done. So let's do this together. And there we go. The knit feels and looks a bit silly and bumpy now, but it will even out, don't worry. Now turn your work inside out. This is the brim of the hat, and now we are to knit the striped part. Let's start with yellow yarn. As shown before, just start knitting with it and do not worry the first loose stitches. Also, do not cut the red yarn. From here, the both yarns are attached to our knitting. Knit 5 rounds with yellow yarn and let the red yarn hang there. Then I'll show how the jogless stripes are done. Here we are, last yellow stitches. Now take the red yarn and leave the yellow yarn hanging. Yellow yarn should stay between your knitting and the red yarn. Now, when starting new stripe, try to keep in mind the even gauge. Do not tighten the red yarn a lot, but try not to leave it overly loose either. But also, don't sweat it. I think these things comes with practice. Knit until the end of the row and I'll meet you there. So here we are. I like to mark the place where the row change is with a stitch marker. Also, I like to change the cable loop to a different spot because it makes things easier when changing colors. Now this is the spot for a jogless stripe trick. I do not know if there is a name for this technique or stitch, but here's how it's done. Put your right hand needle into the yellow stitch under the first red stitch. Lift the yellow stitch to your left hand needle. Then knit the lifted yellow stitch and the first red stitch together. And that's it. Then knit 4 more rows with red yarn and change to yellow. Keep in mind the gauge and remember this trick for jogless stripe. In the beginning of the third stripe, we will start decreasing. I'll meet you there. At first, let's mark the places where we are to decrease with the stitch markers. There will be 5 places in total. The first one is going to be after 2 stitches from the beginning of the row, so place the first marker between the second and third stitch. Then count 25 stitches and place the next marker. So between the yellow markers is to be 25 stitches. Continue like this until you have 5 spots marked. Then let's start decreasing. Knit over the beginning of the row marker and change to the yellow yarn. Striping will continue in its own pace and we'll keep doing the jogless stripe trick as usual on the second row of the stripe. Knit the first 2 stitches and lift the yellow marker. Then simply knit 2 together. Instead of 1, just knit 2 at the same time. Do this after every yellow marker in this row. Then knit 4 regular rows. On the first row of the next stripe, do the decreases again and knit 4 regular rows after. You've done now 2 decrease rows in total. Then follow these steps. Step 1. Knit 1 decrease row and 2 regular rows. Repeat 3 times. Step 2. Knit 1 decrease row and 1 regular row. Repeat 4 times. Step 3. Knit 2 decrease rows and 1 regular row. Repeat once. After that, do decreases on every single row until you have 12 stitches left. That is 3 stitches between the yellow stitch markers. When starting decreasing on every row, don't change the color anymore, but knit the rest with the red yarn. Hopefully these pictures make it easier to check how the decreases are done. Now this is how the hat looks like so far. Let's knit 1 more decrease row and let's remove the stitch markers as we go. The last stitches to decrease are on both sides of our beginning of the row mark. Just remove the marker and do the last decrease. There is only 10 stitches left and the knitting is done. Cut the yarn, but leave long enough tail to do bind off and weaving in the yarn end. Take a darning needle and insert your yarn end through the eye. Then thread the needle through all your stitches and pull through. After one round, make another one. Then take off the needles and tighten the end of your knitting. Stick the needle through your knitting and carefully weave in the yarn end. Also weave in other yarn ends you might have. I like to soak all my knits in warm water about 30 minutes, then wrap them into a towel so that the towel absorbs most of water. Then I lay them dry flat. Adjusting the pattern is easy as long as you know your final gauge. Step 1. Convert your gauge from stitches per 10 centimeters to stitches per 1 centimeter. This is done by shifting the dot one step to the left. Step 2. Measure the head. Let's say the head measurement is X centimeters. Step 3. Count how many stitches you need. Multiply X by your stitches per 1 centimeter. Let's say X is 57.5 centimeters and the gauge is 2.2 stitches per centimeter. Step 4. Find out closest even number that is divisible by 5. 5 is a nice number for this because it is divisible with every even number that ends to 5 or 0. So the closest ones to 126.5 are 125 and 130. 130 stitches would give you 3.5 stitches more. With this imaginary gauge, that is about plus 1.6 centimeters. So instead of 57.5 centimeters, you would get 59.1 centimeters circumference. 125 stitches would be 1.5 stitches less, which would be about 0.7 centimeters. So instead of 57.5 centimeters, you would get 56.8 centimeters of circumference. The fit in general is quite snug with this method of measuring when there is no ease at all. Therefore, it is probably not so drastic to go bigger. But I leave this for you to decide. There are other factors you might want to think when making the decision. Maybe the person has a lot of hair and a bigger hat would be better. Or maybe the person is bald. Maybe the person likes really snug or really loosely fitting hats. Step 5. This is more of a reminder when knitting with your own stitch count. When starting to decrease, divide your stitch count by 5. For example, with 130 stitches, that would be 26. Place the stitch markers for the decreases 26 stitches apart from each other. Otherwise, the pattern works as is for adult sizes and for kid sizes from 10 years and over.